It was just another long-haul flight, New York to London, overnight, business class. The kind of trip frequent flyers know too well. Dimmed cabin lights, the low hum of engines, and the quiet rustle of passengers settling in for sleep. But for one man in seat 2A, this flight would turn into something he never expected. He wasn't flashy. No designer sunglasses, no loud voice demanding attention. Just a black man in his early 40s, dressed in a well-worn but sharp navy suit, carrying the kind of calm that comes from years of leading teams, making tough calls, and staying steady under pressure. He ran a major tech company, thousands of employees, offices across 3 continents, but on this plane he was just another passenger. Or at least he should have been. As the cabin crew began their service, most of them greeted passengers with practiced smiles and polite nods. One flight attendant, however, moved differently around him. She didn't look him in the eye. When she handed him his welcome drink, her fingers barely touched the glass, like she was handing it to someone she'd rather not acknowledge. He noticed but didn't react. He'd seen this before in boardrooms and hotels, even in upscale restaurants. Sometimes it was subtle, sometimes not. He'd learned to read the signs. Dinner service started about an hour into the flight. The menu promised seared salmon with herb quinoa and seasonal vegetables, a standard business class meal. When his tray arrived, something felt off. The smell hit him first, sour, almost rancid. He lifted the lid slowly. The salmon looked grayish at the edges, and the sauce had separated into a greasy film. He poked it gently with his fork. It was slimy, not firm like fresh fish should be. Definitely not safe to eat. He raised his hand politely. The same flight attendant returned, arms crossed slightly, expression tight. "Excuse me," he said, voice calm but clear. "This meal seems spoiled. Could I please get a replacement?" She glanced at the tray without really looking. "That's the only hot meal left," she said flatly. "Unless you pre-ordered a special meal, that's what you get." He blinked. "I didn't see any option to pre-order during check-in," he replied. "And even if I hadn't, surely serving rotten food isn't standard policy." A few passengers nearby turned their heads slightly. One woman in 3C paused her movie. The attendant's jaw tightened. "Well," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound dismissive, "maybe next time you'll plan ahead like everyone else." There it was, the edge in her tone. The implication that he was somehow less deserving, less prepared, less worthy of basic service. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was the way she said it, the way she held herself, like he was an inconvenience, not a customer. He didn't argue. He simply closed the lid on the tray and set it aside. But inside, a quiet anger stirred. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that sharpens focus. He'd spent his whole career proving he belonged in rooms where people assumed he didn't. He wasn't about to let someone make him feel small at 35,000 feet. As the cabin lights dimmed further and passengers drifted off, he stayed awake. He watched. He noticed how the same attendant brought fresh bread to the passenger across the aisle, asked another if they wanted a second glass of wine, even offered a warm blanket to someone who looked chilly. But when he signaled for water, just a glass of water, she walked past his row twice without stopping. Finally, on the 3rd try, she came over, but her eyes stayed fixed on the overhead bin above him, not his face. "Yes?" she asked, like he'd interrupted her. "Could I get some water, please?" he asked again, keeping his tone neutral. She sighed, just barely, but it was there, and walked off. 5 minutes later, she returned with a small plastic cup, half filled, and set it on his tray table without a word. "Oh, here you go," no smile, not even a nod. Just the cup, placed down like an afterthought. That's when the woman in 3C leaned over slightly. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes. She'd been quiet the whole flight, reading a novel. "I saw that," she whispered. "She's been like that only with you. Everyone else got full glasses, warm towels, even chocolates. You got that." She nodded at the half cup of water. He gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thanks for noticing," he said quietly. "It's not right," she added, her voice firm. "Not right at all," he nodded. He knew. But knowing and doing something about it were two different things. And he wasn't just any passenger. He carried responsibility, not just for himself, but for the message his silence might send. If someone in his position let this slide, what chance did others have? He pulled out his phone, opened his notes app, and began typing. Not angrily, but carefully. Time of meal service, description of the food, exact words the attendant used, the times he requested water. the way she avoided him. He even jotted down seat numbers of passengers who'd witnessed parts of it. The woman in 3C, the man in 4A who'd frowned when the attendant snapped at him earlier. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about making sure this didn't happen to the next person who looked like him or spoke with an accent, or simply didn't fit someone's narrow idea of who belongs in business class. Outside the window, the sky was pitch black, dotted with stars. The plane hummed steadily toward London. Inside, the tension was quiet but real. Most passengers slept unaware. But for him, the night had become something else entirely. A reminder that even at the top, dignity isn't always guaranteed. And sometimes standing up for it starts with simply refusing to accept spoiled food. And the message it carries. The hours stretched on, but sleep wouldn't come. Not with that knot in his stomach, the kind that forms when you're treated like you're invisible or worse, like you're a problem just for existing. He leaned back in his seat, eyes half closed, but his mind was wide awake. Every time the cabin lights flickered or a crew member passed by, he watched. Not in a suspicious way, but with the quiet attention of someone who's learned to read a room long before he ever stepped into a boardroom, and what he saw only confirmed what he already felt. The same flight attendant, tall, with a tight bun and a smile that never reached her eyes, moved through the cabin like she owned it. She laughed softly with a group of European businessmen in the front row, refilled their wine without being asked, even offered them extra dessert from the crew's stash. "Just for you," she'd said with a wink. But when she passed his row again, she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead as if he weren't even there. At one point, a young couple a few rows back asked for extra blankets. She brought them too, fluffed them out with care and wished them a good night. Minutes later, he pressed the call button, just to ask if there was any alternative meal available, maybe a salad or even a sandwich. She appeared at the edge of his row, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "We're out of everything," she said flatly. "You'll have to wait until breakfast." "But it's only 10 p.m., he replied gently. "Surely there's something—" "Not for you," she muttered, turning away before he could respond. The words hung in the air like smoke. Not loud enough for a scene, but sharp enough to cut. A few passengers nearby shifted in their seats. The woman in 3C shot him a look that said, "I heard that too." He didn't react outwardly. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture. But inside something shifted. This wasn't just poor service anymore. This was personal. And it was targeted. He thought about all the times he'd been handed the wrong coffee order at meetings while his white colleagues got theirs right. The security guards who followed him through stores he owned shares in. The elevator rides where people suddenly found something very interesting on their phones the moment he stepped in. He'd learned to let most of it roll off his back because reacting every time would drain you dry. But this? On a flight paid for by his company in a seat he'd earned through years of hard work? This felt different. This felt like a line. He reached for his notebook again, not to vent, but to document. Time, 10:12 p.m., request for alternative meal denied. Tone, dismissive. Witness, passenger in 3C, possibly 4A. He wrote it plainly like facts in a report. Because that's what this was, evidence, not emotion. Then, something small but powerful happened. The woman in 3C quietly unbuckled her seatbelt, leaned across the aisle and placed her untouched dessert, a chocolate mousse cup, on his tray table. "I wasn't hungry," she whispered. "And you shouldn't go the whole night without eating." He looked at her, really looked. Her eyes were steady, kind, and full of quiet defiance. In that moment, she wasn't just a fellow traveler. She was an ally. Someone who saw what was happening and chose to do something, however small. "Thank you," he said, voice softer than he intended. "That means more than you know." She gave a small nod and went back to her book, but the gesture lingered. It reminded him he wasn't alone. And sometimes, the smallest acts of humanity are the loudest rebukes to cruelty. As the night wore on, he noticed other things too. The way the lead flight attendant, a man with a calm presence and a warm smile, checked in on passengers evenly, making sure everyone had what they needed. He even paused by his seat once, asked if everything was all right. He almost said something then, but held back. He wanted to be sure. He wanted to be fair. Maybe this one crew member was having a bad night. But patterns don't lie, and this wasn't a one-time slip. It was consistent. It was selective. Around midnight, the cabin grew quieter. Most passengers were asleep. The flight attendants gathered near the galley, whispering. He caught a few words, something about difficult passengers and entitled. He couldn't be sure they were talking about him, but the timing felt too close to be a coincidence. Still, he stayed composed. Anger wouldn't help him here. What would help was clarity, precision, and the knowledge that when this plane landed, he wouldn't just walk away and forget it. He'd worked too hard to build a life where he could speak up, and he owed it to others who couldn't. He thought about his team back home. The young engineers, the customer support staff, the interns just starting out. Many of them faced the same kind of quiet discrimination every day, passed over for projects, talked over in meetings, assumed to be less capable just because of how they looked or where they came from. If he let this slide, what message did that send? That even at the top you still have to swallow disrespect to keep the peace? No, peace wasn't the same as silence. He finished his notes, saved them to the cloud, and tucked his phone away. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to color the horizon, soft purples and oranges bleeding into the dark. They were getting closer to London, closer to the moment when this wouldn't just be an uncomfortable flight memory, but a situation that demanded action. He took a slow breath. Not out of frustration, but resolve. He wasn't looking to get someone fired over a bad meal. But if someone used their position to make another person feel less than, especially based on something as shallow as skin color, then that wasn't just unprofessional. It was wrong, and wrong things shouldn't go unanswered. As the plane began its gentle descent, he straightened his jacket, smoothed his tie, and prepared himself. Not for a fight, but for a conversation that needed to happen. One that might be uncomfortable but necessary, because dignity isn't a luxury, it's a right, and no one should have to beg for it, whether on the ground or in the sky. The plane touched down at Heathrow just after 6 a.m., wheels kissing the tarmac with that familiar thud that signals the end of a long journey. Outside, the sky was pale gray, drizzle misting the windows. Inside, passengers stirred, stretching, blinking away sleep, reaching for carry-ons. But for one man in seat 2A, the real work was just beginning. He didn't rush. He waited as the cabin emptied row by row, watching the same flight attendant, now all business. No trace of the night's coldness. Help elderly passengers with their bags, smile politely at families, even hand a child a set of unused wings. The performance was flawless. To anyone who hadn't been on that flight, she looked like the perfect professional. But he'd seen the other side. And he knew the truth doesn't vanish just because the lights come on. As the last few passengers filed out, he stood, straightened his coat, and walked calmly toward the front of the cabin. The lead flight attendant, a man with silver at his temples and a calm, steady presence, was collecting final feedback forms near the exit. "Excuse me," he said, voice low but clear. "I'd like to file a formal complaint about my experience on this flight." The lead attendant's expression shifted instantly, from routine courtesy to focused attention. "Of course, sir. I'm sorry to hear that. Would you like to speak with me now? Or would you prefer to contact our customer service team after you clear immigration?" "I'd like to speak with you now," he said. "It's important." He kept his tone even, not angry, not dramatic, just firm. He laid out the facts simply. The spoiled meal, the repeated refusals of basic service, the dismissive comments, the clear difference in how he was treated compared to others. He mentioned the timestamps, the witnesses, the way certain words were used, not shouted but loaded. As he spoke, the lead attendant's face grew more serious. He nodded slowly, taking mental notes. "Thank you for telling me this," he said. "We take all concerns about discrimination very seriously." Just then, the other flight attendant, the one he'd been describing, walked past, rolling a service cart. She heard the last part. Her steps slowed. She turned, eyes narrowing. "Oh, here we go," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "The discrimination card again." He didn't flinch. But several nearby passengers, still waiting to deplane, turned to look. One man in a rumpled suit stepped forward slightly. "I was on this flight," he said, voice firm. "And I saw it too." She ignored him for hours. Gave everyone else water, blankets, even extra snacks. Him? Nothing. And that meal was bad. I smelled it from 2 rows away. Another passenger, a woman with a toddler on her hip, added. She even rolled her eyes when he asked for help, like he was bothering her. The flight attendant's face flushed. She crossed her arms. Maybe if he'd acted more like a proper passenger, she snapped. Instead of sitting there like he owns the place, he'd have gotten proper service. The words hung in the air, sharp, ugly, and unmistakable. The lead attendant's expression hardened. "That's enough," he said, voice low but commanding. "You will step away from this conversation immediately." She hesitated, then turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the galley, muttering under her breath. But the damage was done. Her words weren't just heard, they were witnessed. And in that moment, what had started as a private frustration became a public reckoning. Airport staff had already arrived at the jet bridge, and sensing tension, one of them radioed for a customer relations manager from the airline. Within minutes, a woman in a navy blazer approached, badge clipped to her lapel. "Sir," she said, "I understand you've raised a serious concern. Would you be willing to come with me to our arrivals lounge for a quick statement? We'd like to look into this right away." He agreed. As they walked through the quiet terminal, past sleepy travelers and blinking departure boards, he didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just felt tired, not from the flight, but from the weight of having to prove again that he deserved to be treated like a human being. In the lounge, over a cup of fresh coffee, hot, full cup, offered without being asked, he repeated his account. This time, he included the passenger statements, the specific phrases used, the pattern of behavior. The manager listened without interrupting, taking careful notes. "I want to be clear," he said at the end. "This isn't about getting special treatment. It's about equal treatment. I paid the same fare as everyone else. I followed every rule. And yet I was made to feel like I was asking for too much, just by asking for what everyone else got without question." The manager nodded. "You're absolutely right. That's not the standard we uphold. I'll be filing a full incident report today, and our head of cabin services will review it personally. You'll receive a direct response within 24 hours. He thanked her, not because he trusted the system blindly, but because he believed in giving it a chance to do the right thing. As he walked toward baggage claim, the woman from seat 3C caught up to him. She held out a small piece of paper. "I wrote down my contact info," she said. "If they need a witness statement, I'll give it." "What happened wasn't right, and you handled it with more grace than most would." He took the paper, touched by her quiet courage. "Thank you," he said. "Really?" Outside, London rain fell softly. He hailed a cab, slid into the back seat, and finally let out a long breath. The flight was over, but the story wasn't. Because sometimes standing up for yourself isn't loud. It's not about shouting or threats. It's about speaking clearly, staying calm, and refusing to let disrespect slide, especially when you have the power to make sure it doesn't happen again. And as the cab pulled away from the terminal, he knew one thing for sure. When he got back home, this wouldn't end with a complaint. It would begin with a conversation, one that could change more than just one airline's policy. Back home, the jet lag hit hard, but not as hard as the thoughts swirling in his head. He'd expected an apology email, maybe a voucher for a free flight. What he didn't expect was silence for 2 whole days. No call, no message, nothing. It felt like the airline was hoping he'd just forget it. Move on. Pretend it never happened. But he wasn't built that way. On the 3rd morning, still in his robe, he sat at his kitchen table with a strong cup of coffee and opened his laptop. He pulled up the airline's corporate website, scrolled past the glossy photos of smiling crews and luxury cabins, and found the contact page for their executive leadership team. Then he did something most passengers wouldn't think to do. He checked his company's travel records. His company, yes, the one he ran, spent over $2 million a year flying employees across the globe. And nearly 70% of those flights, with this very airline, they had a corporate travel agreement negotiated just last year. That meant he wasn't just a customer. He was a client. A big one. That changed everything. He didn't write an angry letter. No accusations, no threats. Instead, he drafted a calm, professional email to the airline's CEO. He outlined the incident fact by fact, the spoiled meal, the refusal of service, the discriminatory remarks, the witness accounts. He attached his notes, the timestamps, even the passenger's written statement from the woman in 3C. Then he added one more paragraph. As a company that values inclusion and dignity in our own workplace, we cannot in good conscience continue a partnership with an organization that fails to uphold those same standards in its customer service. Until we see concrete steps toward accountability and systemic change, including disciplinary action, staff retraining, and a review of your onboard conduct policies, we will be suspending our corporate travel contract effective immediately. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Within 3 hours, his phone rang. Not the customer service line, not a generic office number. It was the CEO's direct line. The voice on the other end was polite, concerned, and, most importantly, listening. They talked for nearly 20 minutes. The CEO admitted they'd received his complaint but hadn't realized the full scope until his email landed. "We're launching an internal investigation today," he said. "And I want you to know, if what you've described is true, it violates everything we stand for." 2 days later, the airline issued a formal response. The flight attendant had been placed on immediate suspension pending a full review. Within a week, they confirmed she'd been let go. Not just for serving spoiled food, but for violating their code of conduct on discrimination and professional behavior. More than that, they invited him to join a new advisory panel on diversity in air travel. But he didn't stop there. In his weekly leadership meeting, he brought up the incident, not to vent, but to ask a question. How many of our people have faced something like this while traveling for work? And what are we doing to protect them? The room fell quiet. One young woman on his team spoke up softly. "Last year in Frankfurt, security pulled me aside 3 times while my white colleagues walked right through. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to seem difficult." Another team member nodded. "I've been mistaken for staff at conferences, even when I'm giving the keynote." It hit him then. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about a pattern that followed people like them everywhere, even when they'd made it. So he made a decision. His company would no longer just book flights and hope for the best. They'd add a new clause to all travel contracts. Any partner airline must provide proof of anti-bias training for frontline staff. They'd also create an internal reporting system where employees could flag discriminatory experiences without fear of being ignored. And every quarter, they'd review which airlines met their standards and which didn't. Word spread fast. Other companies, some bigger, some smaller, started asking how they could do the same. A tech founder in Seattle reached out. A nonprofit leader in Atlanta shared her own story. Suddenly, what began as one man's bad meal turned into a quiet movement. The airline, to their credit, didn't just issue a statement and disappear. They rolled out mandatory unconscious bias training for all cabin crew, introduced anonymous passenger feedback forms that went straight to HR, not the flight team, and even hired a third-party firm to audit their customer service practices. They also reinstated his company's contract, but this time, with new terms that put dignity on the same level as on-time performance. He didn't do it for headlines. He didn't want praise. He just wanted to make sure the next person, whether they were flying for work, for family, or just for a vacation, wouldn't have to sit in silence while someone made them feel small. One evening, weeks later, he got an email from the woman in 3C. She'd seen a news snippet about the airline's new training program. "I'm glad you spoke up," she wrote. "Because of you, someone else might get the respect they deserve just for being human." He read that line 3 times. Then he closed his laptop, walked to the window, and watched the city lights blink on one by one. It wasn't about firing one person. It was about lighting a path so others wouldn't have to walk in the dark, and that was worth every uncomfortable conversation, every late-night email, every moment of doubt. Because real change doesn't start with grand speeches. It starts with one person saying, "This isn't right," and refusing to let it go. A few months after the flight, something unexpected happened. Not in a boardroom or an airline office, but in a small community college classroom in Manchester. A young woman studying hospitality management received a letter telling her she'd been awarded a full scholarship for the rest of her degree. The note attached was simple: "For students who believe service means respect. For everyone." It was signed not by a foundation or a celebrity, but by the CEO of a major tech company, and it carried the name of a passenger who'd once offered a stranger a dessert on a long flight. Eleanor. That small act of kindness, the chocolate mousse passed across the aisle, had stayed with him. It reminded him that change doesn't always come from power. Sometimes it starts with one person choosing to see another person's humanity, and he wanted to honor that. But the scholarship was just the beginning. He reached out to the airline again, not as a client this time, but as a partner. Together, they launched a new training program for flight crews, co-designed with diversity experts and real passenger feedback. It wasn't just about don't be racist, it was practical, human-centered stuff, how to recognize your own biases, how to respond when you've made someone uncomfortable, how to treat every passenger like they belong because they do. The program included role-playing real scenarios, anonymous reporting tools, and even guest speakers who'd experienced discrimination while traveling. What made it different? It wasn't punishment-driven. It was built on empathy, and it worked. Within a year, the airline saw a 40% drop in service-related complaints, and employee satisfaction scores actually went up. Crews said they felt more prepared, more confident, and more connected to their purpose, not just to serve meals, but to make people feel safe and seen. He didn't stop there. He shared the training framework, free of charge, with other airlines, hotels, and even rideshare companies. This isn't about giving us an advantage, he told his team. It's about raising the bar for everyone. Back at his own company, things changed too. Employees started speaking up more, not just about travel issues, but about everyday moments where they felt overlooked or underestimated. And instead of being brushed off, those concerns were taken seriously. Managers were trained to listen first, fix second. The culture shifted quietly but deeply. One afternoon, a new intern, a young man fresh out of college, stayed late to ask a question. "I saw your post about the flight," he said, a little nervous. "I've had similar things happen. At restaurants, at networking events. I always wondered, how do you know when to speak up?" He leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment. "You don't need to have all the answers," he said. "You just need to know your worth. And remember, silence protects the system. Speaking up protects people." The intern nodded, eyes a little brighter. That moment, small as it was, meant more than any press feature or award. Then came the LinkedIn post, the one that went viral without trying to. No flashy language, no drama, just a few honest paragraphs about what happened on that flight, what he did, and why it mattered. He ended with this: "Leadership isn't about titles or corner offices. It's about using whatever platform you have, big or small, to make sure dignity isn't a privilege but a promise." People shared it by the thousands, not because it was angry, but because it was hopeful. Teachers tagged their students. Flight attendants wrote in to say they were proud to be part of an industry trying to do better. Parents said they'd show it to their kids. But the most powerful messages came from strangers who'd never flown business class. People who'd been ignored at diners, followed in stores, talked down to on customer service calls. "Thank you for saying what so many of us feel but can't afford to say," one wrote. "You used your position to lift others up. That's real power." He read every message, saved the ones that moved him, and kept going because the truth was this wasn't over. One fired attendant, one new training program, that was just a start. Real change takes time. It takes consistency. It takes people in every role, whether they're serving meals at 35,000 feet or answering phones in a call center, choosing every day to treat others with basic respect. Years later, when people asked him about that flight, he never framed it as a victory. It wasn't about getting someone fired, he'd say. It was about making sure the next person didn't have to go through it. And in a quiet way, that's exactly what happened. On a flight from Chicago to Paris last spring, a black woman in business class was served a meal that smelled off. She mentioned it politely. The flight attendant apologized immediately, brought a fresh meal from first class, and even checked back twice to make sure everything was okay. No hesitation. No side-eye. Just service, equal, respectful, human. She later wrote to the airline to thank them. In her note, she added, "It felt like I belonged. And that shouldn't be rare, but it still is. So thank you for getting it right." That letter ended up on his desk, forwarded by the airline's CEO with a simple note. "Because of you." He didn't need credit. But he did feel something deep and quiet. Satisfaction, not pride. The kind that comes when you plant a seed and finally see it grow. Life went on. Flights kept flying. People kept traveling. But somewhere along the way, the air got a little cleaner. Not just in the cabins, but in the way we treat each other when no one's watching. And that, more than anything, was the real story. Not a CEO firing someone in anger, but a human being choosing to turn pain into purpose, and in doing so, making the world just a little kinder for the person coming next.